It was the year 1977. The small coastal town of Redwood Shores was quiet, with a chilly breeze whispering through the trees, carrying with it an eerie stillness. Officer Janet Collins, a 26-year-old rookie cop, had just begun her routine night patrol. She was one of the very few female officers in the department, known for her discipline, sharp instincts, and the respect she commanded despite her young age. That night, like many before it, she signed in, picked up her cruiser, and began making her rounds along the darkened roads. At exactly 8:12 p.m., Janet radioed in from her patrol car. She calmly reported that she was making a routine traffic stop near a remote stretch of coastal highway, Route 17, close to the ocean cliff overlook. Her voice sounded steady, professional, as she described spotting a suspicious vehicle parked just off the road. That was the last time anyone ever heard from her. When dispatch tried to follow up just minutes later, there was no response from Janet's radio. Officers were immediately sent to her last known location near the ocean cliff overlook. What they found was deeply unsettling. Her patrol car, empty, with the engine still running and the driver's side door left open. Her flashlight was on the ground nearby, still glowing faintly. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints leading away from the scene. Just the sound of waves crashing far below the cliffside and the creeping fog swallowing the coastline. A full-scale search began that night. Dozens of officers, search dogs, helicopters, and local volunteers scoured the area for days. They covered the surrounding forest, cliffs, and shoreline, but Janet had vanished as if into thin air. No body, no blood, no clothing, nothing. The only thing investigators had was a mystery and a growing fear that something terrible had happened. Janet's family and colleagues were devastated. Her disappearance hit the town hard, and for months, theories swirled. Did she fall off the cliff? Was she abducted? Did she uncover something she shouldn't have? But as time passed and no answers came, the case went cold. Until 13 years later, when something surfaced that would reignite the entire investigation. 13 years had passed since Janet Collins vanished, and her name had faded into the archives of unsolved mysteries. Until one foggy morning in 1990, when a maintenance crew working on the old storm drainage system near Ocean Cliff made a chilling discovery. The workers had been clearing a clogged section of pipe that ran deep beneath the coastal road, a pipe that hadn't been touched in decades. As they worked their way into the corroded tunnel, something caught one worker's eye, a flash of metal wedged behind years of debris and sediment. At first, they thought it was just trash, until they pulled it free. It was a rusted police badge. The name was barely visible beneath the corrosion, but one word stood out like a ghost from the past: Collins. The crew immediately called authorities, and within hours, a full excavation team arrived. What they would find inside that old drainage pipe would horrify even the most seasoned detectives. Behind the rusted grate, embedded in the cold, wet darkness, were the decomposed remains of a human skeleton, still wearing remnants of a police-issued belt and uniform buttons. There was no question anymore. Janet Collins had been found. The discovery of Janet Collins's remains stunned the entire town of Redwood Shores. For over a decade, her disappearance had been a haunting mystery. Now, it was a confirmed tragedy. The site was immediately sealed off, and forensics teams began their painstaking work. The corroded badge, fragments of her uniform, and the position of the body all suggested one thing: Janet hadn't fallen by accident. She had been deliberately hidden. What troubled investigators the most was the location. The drainage pipe where her body was found was nearly a mile from the cliff's edge where her car had been discovered. There was no logical way for her to have ended up there on her own. Someone had moved her, possibly after killing her, and stashed her in the tunnel to cover their tracks. Detectives began combing through the original case files, questioning retired officers and re-interviewing old witnesses. The new evidence triggered long-buried rumors. Some spoke of internal corruption in the police department back in the 70s. Others recalled Janet mentioning discomfort around a few senior officers, but nothing had ever been proven. Now, with a body and a crime scene, they finally had a starting point, and one name, quietly buried in the old records, began to resurface: a man Janet had pulled over the night she vanished. A man who was never properly investigated. Buried deep in the 1977 incident logs, investigators found a name linked to Janet's final radio transmission. Thomas Rayburn, a 42-year-old local contractor with a history of minor offenses, including public intoxication and trespassing. On the night Janet vanished, he had been parked near Ocean Cliff in an old green pickup truck. At the time, officers questioned him briefly, but without any signs of foul play and no evidence connecting him to her disappearance, he was released. Now 13 years later, with Janet's body found and circumstances pointing to foul play, Rayburn became the first person of interest. Detectives discovered he had left town just 2 days after Janet went missing and hadn't returned since. A deeper background check revealed disturbing details. Rayburn had been dismissed from multiple jobs due to erratic behavior and allegations of harassment, including one incident involving a female co-worker just months before Janet's disappearance. Authorities tracked him to a rural part of Oregon, where he had been living under the radar for years, working odd jobs and staying off the grid. When investigators arrived, Rayburn didn't resist, but he looked visibly shaken when they mentioned Janet Collins by name. Something in his eyes changed. Fear, guilt, or something darker? Thomas Rayburn was brought in for questioning under tight security. Now in his mid-50s, he looked worn down by life, his hands trembling slightly, his eyes sunken but alert. Investigators began slowly, asking about the night of October 3rd, 1977. Rayburn claimed he barely remembered it, just that he had been drinking by the cliffside, trying to clear his head. But as detectives pressed him, inconsistencies began to surface. He said he never interacted with Janet that night, but radio logs clearly placed her at his location. When shown the badge recovered from the drainage pipe, Rayburn went silent. His breathing grew shallow. Then, almost in a whisper, he said, "She shouldn't have followed me." The room froze. Investigators leaned in. "What do you mean by that?" one asked. But Rayburn shook his head and refused to say more. He lawyered up immediately and the interview ended. Still, that one sentence, "She shouldn't have followed me," was enough to get a search warrant. Over the next few days, a full forensic team combed through his property in Oregon, hoping to find anything that could tie him definitively to Janet's murder. What they found was a locked box buried beneath his workshop floor. Inside were old photos, newspaper clippings about Janet's disappearance, and something even more disturbing. The box unearthed from beneath Rayburn's workshop was weathered by time, but its contents were chillingly well preserved. Investigators carefully laid everything out. Dozens of yellowed newspaper clippings about Janet's disappearance, articles from the local paper, copies of missing persons flyers, and even an old police memo that had never been released to the public. It was clear that Rayburn had obsessively followed the case for years after the fact, but one item stood out above all the others: a faded Polaroid photo. It showed a woman, bound, her police badge barely visible on her uniform. The photo was blurred and dimly lit, but it was unmistakably Janet Collins. The image had been taken in a confined space, possibly underground, and her eyes were wide with fear. Forensic experts dated the photograph to late 1977, shortly after she vanished. It was the smoking gun the case needed. Rayburn was formally charged with kidnapping and murder. The town of Redwood Shores was in disbelief. After 13 years, the mystery of Janet's fate was finally unraveling. But with each answer came more questions. Why had Rayburn kept the evidence? Why did he follow the investigation so closely? And most importantly, was he working alone? As the case against Thomas Rayburn grew stronger, detectives began to explore a darker possibility, that Janet's murder wasn't a random act of violence, but part of something larger. They revisited the original investigation files from 1977 and started noticing disturbing omissions. Several witness statements had been left out of the final report. One in particular stood out. A gas station attendant had told police he saw Janet arguing with two men the night she disappeared, but only Rayburn had ever been questioned. Digging deeper, investigators uncovered an unspoken truth within the Redwood Shores Police Department during the late 70s. There were quiet rumors of corruption, officers involved in shady land deals, unreported bribes, and suppressed complaints. Janet, known for her integrity, had apparently raised concerns in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. But her warnings were dismissed, and no official complaint was ever filed. One name kept surfacing in internal memos. Deputy Carl Mercer, a senior officer and one of the last people known to speak to Janet before her final patrol. At the time, he had vouched for Rayburn's innocence and convinced detectives not to pursue the lead further. When approached now, in retirement, Mercer appeared calm, but his answers were vague, his memory conveniently hazy. Suddenly, the theory shifted. What if Janet hadn't just stumbled upon a suspicious man, but a conspiracy she was never meant to uncover? With mounting evidence suggesting a cover-up, investigators decided to confront Deputy Carl Mercer. When they visited him at his home, Mercer was initially cooperative but grew defensive as questions turned toward his role the night Janet vanished. He denied any involvement but couldn't explain why crucial witness statements were missing, or why he had pushed to clear Rayburn so quickly, faced with new evidence. Phone records placing Mercer near the Ocean Cliff area that night, and testimony from a former officer who claimed Mercer had warned him to stay quiet. Mercer's facade began to crack. The man once respected in the community was now under suspicion of obstructing justice and possibly worse. Mercer refused to confess, but his evasiveness only deepened the mystery. Meanwhile, forensic teams uncovered traces of fabric matching Janet's uniform hidden in Mercer's personal vehicle during a recent search, suggesting a physical connection to the crime scene. The town was shaken to its core. The trusted deputy, who had led the investigation, may have been protecting someone, or even responsible himself. But without a confession or direct evidence, the case remained tangled in shadows. After months of relentless investigation and court battles, the pieces finally began to fall into place. Thomas Rayburn stood trial for the kidnapping and murder of Janet Collins, with mounting evidence tying him to the crime. Deputy Carl Mercer was also formally charged with obstruction of justice and tampering with evidence. Witnesses came forward, revealing a tangled web of fear, intimidation, and silence that had allowed the truth to remain buried for so long. In a tense courtroom, Rayburn maintained his innocence until the overwhelming forensic and photographic evidence convinced the jury otherwise. He was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. Mercer, though never directly linked to the murder itself, was held accountable for his role in covering up the crime and received a lengthy prison sentence. For Janet's family, the verdict brought bittersweet closure, painful reminders of what was lost, but finally, a sense that justice had been served. The town of Redwood Shores slowly began to heal, though the shadow of that fateful night lingered for years to come. Janet Collins' story became a somber reminder of courage, corruption, and the cost of uncovering the truth beneath the surface of a quiet coastal town.